Good morning. My name is Kathy Wanner. I'd like to begin by offering thanks to Erle, not only for working his technological magic, but for organizing this event, and to his entire team as well. It's a big deal for all of you to be here early on a Sunday morning, so thanks to those in the room and thanks to those online. I'm an anthropologist, and I've conducted ethnographic research in Ukraine for about 25 years or so on the politics of religion, which is what has gotten me into issues of morality and ethics in particular. I was really intrigued by the theme of this event because I also do some fiber art. So for me, fragments are not necessarily a bad thing, or fragmentation is not necessarily a bad thing, because referring back to our first speaker, you can have fragments, but you can nonetheless bring fragments together and create something of a beautiful whole. What I'm going to speak about today is what happens, though, when your fragments begin fraying, when the various elements that make up your fragments begin pulling apart. And so the fragments themselves are no longer so identifiable. And of course, that makes stitching various kinds of norms, be they religious, conventional, or moral, into anything approximating a social order. So I should say that this presentation is based on those years of ethnographic research, as well as some work I did up until last year with the United States Institute of Peace as a peace negotiator on behalf of Ukraine in terms of trying to find some path forward out of this war. So let me begin by first reminding everyone of this war, because it's, of course, pre-Iran, pre-Venezuela, so many conflicts that have erupted since then. There are many reasons that have made ending this war very difficult. Wars are inevitably easy to start and very difficult to end. It began in 2014 with what was a hybrid war. In other words, there was no declaration of war. There were no soldiers with uniforms that had insignias that identified who they were representing and the like. It was called a hybrid war also because it was not just a war of guns, but also a war of information. So it started in 2014. It, of course, vastly expanded in 2022 with the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so here I've got, in the beginning, in the early year or two of the after the full-scale invasion, there was some shifting of territories, but it has more or less become something of a frozen conflict since then. And that's essentially because the front line is so heavily mined at this point that Russian forces can't move forward without demining first, and Ukrainian forces can't drive them back without also demining first. So although once the full-scale Russian invasion began, there was broad consensus that this was a just war and one could or should support Ukraine. The issue now is what might constitute a just peace that could bring an end to this very, very unfortunate conflict, that now that everyone's attention is shifted to the Middle East and oil and all kinds of other things, we don't see that, in fact, the Russian attack on Ukraine has, in fact, intensified in the last few days. It continues to produce tremendous, tremendous casualties on both sides. So I want to think about then what are the sources of fragmentation, and also what are the sources of fraying. So in essence, among the troubling points are the territorial disputes. Boundaries, for me, in terms of the title of this event, were literally physical boundaries that have been violated, and now there's attempts to redraw boundaries. And so you have contentious claims as to who is the rightful heir to certain lands. regardless of how the boundaries eventually settle, there's a corollary set of concerns that have to do with so-called security concerns. How, even once boundaries are established, how perhaps one could guarantee that they remain established, and that given the originally hybrid nature of this war, there are, of course, vast concerns that conflict these days takes many, many different forms, and there are many, many different arenas in which war can play out. And so how could one perhaps guarantee some kind of security concerns going forward? And these are, of course, some of the sources of the fragmentation. It's further highlighted by the fact that, of course, there are tremendous investments at this point after we're now into our 5th year of war. And this has been tremendously, as I mentioned, punishing, far more so punishing on the Russian side than one ever anticipated. And of course, a fierce sense of betrayal on the Ukrainian side to the extent that when Ukraine traded in its nuclear weapons, they signed an accord which was called the Budapest Memorandum, in which it was assured that should Ukraine be attacked, the US and Russia would come to its defense. But of course, that entire accord was premised on the fact that the US would never attack and Russia would never attack. So there's very much of a sense of betrayal. So this then goes to the heart of this kind of moral injury. You had an event the other day about when does the difference between moral wrongness and evil. And I'm afraid for many people in this part of the world, especially those on the Ukrainian side, this invasion is not just morally wrong, it has spilled over into the domain of being an actual evil act that continues to perpetuate a further series of evil acts. So against that kind of background, how then could one begin to discuss what might constitute a just peace? What might be the grounds upon which we could reestablish some semblance of a cessation of armed combat. I'm afraid at this point that's the goal, is simply the cessation of armed combat. Nobody has any illusions as to whether it would actually constitute peace or not. And this, of course, is against the backdrop of these kinds of public memorials throughout Kiev, as well as in Russia, where you have very much of a personalization of those who have been killed, and their faces appear quite consistently in all kinds of popular memorials. So, given the escalation and the lack of promise, what to do? So, certainly when I was at the U.S. Institute of Peace, before it was shut down and became and was renamed and under new management, the issues were how to end this kind of a war, what would constitute some kind of restorative justice or reparations, and moreover, so as to defer the establishment of some kind of a Korea-like situation whereby you would have divided lands and perhaps a cessation of combat, but absolutely no declaration of peace, and quite simply a highly fortified, highly militarized border. So there was attempts to try to find mechanisms that could deter sort of future armed aggression. This is obviously all a very, very tall order, but having said that, there's nowhere to go but forward. So the question is how to conceive of this. If we have sort of the fragments, as I pointed to before, what are some of the sources that are fueling the kind of moral fraying, the ways in which those fragments are themselves coming apart? And on the side of the Ukrainians, the temperature rises very rapidly, given that they very much consider this an existential war. There have been a plethora of pronouncements on the part of the president of the Russian Federation, as well as the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, that there are no Ukrainians, and as a result, there should be no state, and these are historically Russian lands, and so on and so on. And that's why this is, for example, not a war, according to Russian rhetoric, but rather a special military operation. And you notice, of course, all kinds of other rhetoric that is floating about these days about excursions and the like. This is quite a tactic of sorts. But there is the brute reality that one confronts, and this is really just a very physical form of fraying. You have two countries that are both in demographic crisis, and we don't have specific statistics coming from Russia at this point. But even prior to 2022, both Russia and Ukraine had some of the lowest birth rates in the country. And we know now for a fact that Ukraine has the single highest kill rate, as they call it. In other words, the highest death rate. So we're really looking at a very, very, very acute demographic crises in both of these countries. We have Russian demographers that in their most draconian predictions claim that there will be no Russians as of 2050. I don't think it's quite that bad, but you get the point. Finding any kind of consensus is further tempered by the fact that there's a tremendous lack of any kind of trust in institutions. So whether one speaks of, as we did earlier, religious institutions putting forth moral norms or any kind of moral pronouncements, there's a certain degree of suspicion of them. There's enormous suspicion of state authorities. So anything that could approximate, whether state institutions or any other kinds of social institutions, the kind of conventional norms, moral norms that we spoke of earlier, there's enormous critical attention paid to those. And there is sort of a binary that has developed that depicts the sort of us, them, in-group, out-group, and that would, of course, present a very serious challenge, but that is then further compounded by a wide spectrum of very, what I wrote here as evil and monstrous terms to refer to the others. And what is interesting to me is they very often take not just animal illusions or plant-based illusions, in other words, illusions from nature, but cross them in strange ways so as to suggest that that they see each other in very, what I wrote here, these monstrous kinds of terms. In other words, there's the expression pig dogs that Ukrainians use to refer to Russians, right? So they're not just pigs, they're not just dogs, but they're pig dogs. It's sort of taking the worst of both and combining them. And similarly, on the Russian side, they refer to Ukrainians as dill heads. I mean, in other words, they're not human, they're not vegetation or vegetable, but there's some kind of chimeric cross between the two. So this, of course, those kinds of projections of the outgroup as being not just an outgroup, but some kind of a monstrous cross that is utterly unrecognizable. And then against even another fraying of any kind of moral norms is driven by the fact that there has been enormous sacrifice on both sides, certainly in terms of human life, but of course this is an enormous resource drain in countries that are not particularly opulent or countries whose wealth is not evenly shared. And so this really emphasizes this sense of sacrifice and begs the question, what was it all for? So when these kinds of moral fragments begin to fray, and there's less of a sense of norms of any kind, whether one speaks about moral norms or conventional norms or religious norms, really against this backdrop, what one has is this a broad sense of anomie. And against the backdrop of a normlessness, that only further well, in my better moments, I see it as as something of an opportunity. In other words, when so much has been destroyed, that means also the barriers to change have been destroyed. So you try to be optimistic and put that all the possibilities in front of you. But yet, when there is this backdrop of normlessness, it becomes very difficult to forge any kind of consensus. And that leads to what I think is what few people expected would be some of the biggest impediments to forging any kind of dialogue even on what might constitute a just peace. So the moral fraying has taken a turn as to engage the idea of the ethics of who has a right to speak, who has a right to even comment on what might be a just peace, what might be the terms of restorative justice. And we see tremendous then fraying again between picking up on this notion of sacrifice, who in fact has sacrificed by either being a combatant or being a volunteer in this effort, or a draft dodger in the worst case. We all know that not everyone is cut out for moral combat, for military combat, I mean, and all men from the ages of 18 to 60 are mobilized, and the average age fighting in Ukraine is in the high 40s. Somewhere between 47 and 49. That's the average age of combatant in Ukraine. It's only a slight bit lower among Russian forces as well. So in other words, one looks at draft dodgers, of which there are some. And to draft dodge, I might add, it's not that one crosses to Canada as one did in the US. That means people stay in their apartments. And at this point, they're in their apartments for years. So I hardly need tell the many psychologists in the room what that does to a person's psyche. But that bespeaks some of the quandaries that one faces when trying to say who has a right to participate in the dialogue that could perhaps establish what might be acceptable grounds for peace. And that goes to the heart of what I wrote here in terms of, does sacrifice come with a payback? So in other words, those who have sacrificed, do they have a privileged voice? And those who have not, who either went abroad, and there are over 6 million Ukrainians who were able to leave the country. That's no longer possible. I should also quickly add that this is a fairly patriarchal society, and they quickly integrated the armed forces, so now there are women in combat as well, too. So it begins to weigh in sort of the value of sacrifice. What constitutes sacrifice? Is volunteering? Of course, many people are volunteering as medics and with technological expertise and manufacturing drones in their kitchens and the likes. There's many, many different ways of volunteering, but how does that get equated with being an active combatant? Or someone for physical or emotional reasons might not wish to serve. So there's a fraying among those who have participated in the war effort, but then that gets compounded by those who remained within Ukraine and those who have left. Those who have left have largely gone to other parts in Europe, and although given the demographic crisis, one hopes very much that they will return to Ukraine, but clearly they're going to return with perhaps new credentials, perhaps some capital, new experiences, new ideas, and certainly their own opinions as to what would constitute a just peace and how issues of restorative justice could be articulated and how the country could be rebuilt. So this leaves one such as myself, how can you begin to study this kind of a process, especially when you are dealing with a great many people who have experienced trauma of all kinds? How can you identify some form of consensus? And this will be I'll be wrapping up with this. So the sort of interesting turn that I, as an anthropologist, inevitably have done interview-based research with human beings, have turned to is to try to engage people to speak about the war in terms of animals, different kinds of animals, not just companion pets, but livestock, wildlife, and zoo animals, to try to the difficulties of articulating what one has been through and seen sometimes can be mitigated if people speak about their engagement with various kinds of animals. It also becomes a basis of consensus because it bespeaks the damage that has been done to the ecosystem. And as any of us in the room who consider issues of climate change and other forms of environmental degradation know, there's no respect for borders when it comes to any of those issues. So in other words, that the earlier map that I showed you of the occupied territories, I mean, various officials from the Environmental Protection Agency have said that would just be declared, that would be a Superfund site. It's not fit for human habitation, the whole area. That's how polluted the air, the land, and the water are at this point. So, how then does one begin to repair both the moral fragmentation and the moral fraying? And so by being able to discuss the war in terms of not necessarily individual experience, but in fact the experience of animals and damage to the ecosystem that animals are experiencing, with the recognition, of course, that the human beings who live in close proximity to all of those forms of animal life, of course, suffer the same catastrophic ecosystems. So the idea is to try to establish some form of consensus for ending this war based on environmental grounds, and to try to use that as a premise for some kind of action that could, in some way, at least end armed combat. And it bespeaks then, perhaps as the person who's an anthropologist focused on human beings, really the growing urgency of thinking in interspecies terms, because calamities of all forms have deleterious effects, not just for us, but for the various flora and fauna around us. So that has been my few thoughts on moral fraying and moral fragmentation. Thank you very much for your attention. Ben?
Thanks, Kathy. So I'm sympathetic to your overall approach. But how would you answer the skeptic when you think of the massive animal suffering that goes on daily in the world that people just don't care about or almost actively try to ignore? And if that's the status quo, if that's just sort of how the world just goes about, what hope is there that concerns about animals, the environment, would have a meaningful change in the Ukraine context?
That's a great question. The issue of course, you were speaking about food industries of sorts. That's a longstanding interest of my own, and I recognize that that kind of violence is perpetuated here and elsewhere, and really arguably throughout the world. True enough, but in the same breath, I mean, I don't necessarily see it as a zero-sum game. That is to say that attention to how animal suffering might be a result of war then somehow gives a free pass to various industrial forms of farming. Rather, I'm hoping that, in fact, one could be an entree into the other. I also think that, for example, given all that is going on in the Strait of Hormuz right around now, having done this kind of research and having known what this does, for example, not just to fishing industry, to stick with your question, but just wildlife more broadly, there's almost no attention to that. I mean, in other words, when you look at various organizations, We Animals and all kinds of other organizations that focus on the abuses to animals, there's almost never considerations of what war does to them. And I think it's important to, in fact, widen the spectrum of, and with hoping that people will enter one of those doors. So I would look at it as one should be wider in the perspective rather than trying to say we have to all go through via seeing the agricultural farming as a form of regularized violence, which I think it is.
So as we kind of end this first session and transition into the panel of Ben Jones, I would encourage from our first three speakers, so Simone, Meltem, Kathy, are there questions you have for each other or things, as we kind of see different ways you've cast fragmentations through the lens of your particular disciplinary approaches, are there any connections or complementarities you think are stood out to you or interesting to you to sort of put you on the spot?
What really caught my attention, thank you, Kathy, if I may, is the amalgamation of the animal and plants. So we study a lot, and I do a lot of research on anthropomorphization and dehumanization. And that caught my attention because we often look at each type of dehumanization by itself. Are you more like a machine, more like an animal, more like an insect? And this made me think of the Frankensteinization of dehumanization, and how, in terms of, if I think about the research in the business world, how it might affect motivation. That, yes, we know that dehumanizing the enemy can make us motivated, make us work harder, but can this, seeing them as monsters that can't even exist in the real world, make people more resilient to staying in their apartments for long times? Not that it helps and makes them avoid any trauma, but it just made me wonder, what are the thought processes going on, and how can it affect their motivation to fight and their subsequent living situation?
Maybe I'll answer very briefly and then add a question of my own. I think you're exactly right. This is sort of goes to the heart of the existential part of it. And so one is then, this is where you have then, I think the oldest person fighting now is 83. So where you have people who are willing to join up and fight. Why they might be willing to do that, and then similarly, the fear factor and the fear of being erased might also motivate somebody to stay in their apartment for 2 or 3 years. So it just really intensifies everything. But I think those kinds of dehumanizing, just utterly monstrous and frightening, that just intensifies both fears and determination. And the phrase that gets tossed around quite a lot is resilience, but this kind of incessant inventiveness to continue to exist. That I think is where that comes from. The one thing which I wanted, if I can just ask a brief question, this strikes me as the importance then of whatever kind of norm one speaks about is the importance of having some kind of institutional grounding. And of course, I didn't add family businesses here, but there's tremendous suspicion of the cronyism, not just in family businesses, but in all businesses. So I could add that as a list of state institutions and religious institutions. What happens when you have very, very weak social institutions? by extension, whether you're talking about ethical norms, moral norms, you really do see the fragmentation goes into a process of fraying. That's what I realized engaging your theme of fragmentation. It not only, it really begins to almost dissolve before your eyes. So I would, I guess, encourage everyone to think about to what extent certain kinds of institutions, universities perhaps, or all kinds of others, perhaps really serve a vital role in terms of at least being a site of dialogue, if not construction of certain norms, be they ethical or moral.